Okay, welcome to the last session. We've had such a stimulating day already. It's a bit difficult to see, how we can absorb more, but I know we will. And it's a great pleasure to invite David Stuckler up, who's from the University of Oxford, who was in Cambridge. And you've heard his name many times already today. He's extremely well known, and he's Professor of Political Economy and Sociology at the University of Oxford, and has very strong links to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he is very well known. I think I need to say no more, and in the interest of time, David, looking forward to hearing you.
Carol, thanks for the very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to come back to Cambridge and to see so many friends and colleagues here in the audience. I was really scratching my head to figure out what to talk about because I worked with Martin, and, Larry, and Anna, as well as Sarah closely. So I wanted to turn to a topic that is in political economy of health and is still an issue. It has been now for the past 8 years. I want to talk about the impact of austerity, of deep budget cuts on health in Europe. It's now been 8 years since the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression engulfed Europe, and the storm has not yet passed. Last I checked, half of Europe's economies are still in recession, still yet to recover to where their economies were almost a decade ago. And for those people who have lost homes, who have lost jobs, especially youth who are looking for work and can't find it, the crisis is only beginning. In Spain and places like Greece, up to 3 in 4 youth can't find work, the scale of which is a public health emergency. And meanwhile, politicians have been debating, among other things, Brexit, but debating endlessly how to deal with debt and deficits, much of which was created from the huge bailouts of the banking sector to over £1 trillion in the UK and US. That's a huge sum. And to cope with these deficits, many have been choosing a path of deep cuts to balance the books. And all too often, in this conversation about cuts, those who are affected, the voices of those who those policy changes will impact, go unheard. And that's why I wanted to introduce you. You're probably wondering by now, who's this disgruntled-looking boy? It's not me at a younger age. This is Kieran McArdle. And at the ripe age of 13, he's already bitter. He blames the government for killing his father. Maybe hard to see in the back. It's his dad, Brian, in the picture. And Brian had worked as a security guard for about 2 decades in Lanarkshire, not far from Glasgow, until a few Christmases ago, he had a massive stroke. It left him blind in one eye, paralyzed on the left side, and barely able to speak. And so, Brian to turn to the government for help to make ends meet for his family. With that government in the hands of a conservative coalition here in the UK would prove no friend to the McArdles. Because in an effort to tackle what they called an epidemic of scroungers, of people they believed were cheating the system, they contracted the private French company Atos to start conducting fitness for work tests. And so, like others, Brian was called in. I was a little nervous to do one of these tests because, over a quarter of the buildings where the tests were taking place weren't wheelchair accessible. But Brian went to the Atos test, and he did his best. 2 weeks later, through the post, and one of those brown envelopes from HM Revenue, his benefits had been cut. Brian had been deemed fit for Uh, as a public health researcher, it was difficult to understand the government's logic in this conversation, because if you look at what I took here, a spreadsheet from the Department of Work and Pensions, where they're estimating how much money they were losing each year due to fraud in the disability system. For the year they did the screening of Brian McArdle, they estimated there was a target of about £2 million that was being overpaid due to fraud. Well, the contract with Atos, the private company, was £400 million a year. £400 million, costing taxpayers more. And this is the great irony that we've seen in our work as we've looked across Europe and North America at times of cuts to save money. Austerity's had the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than shrink deficits, it's made them wider. And what we've commonly been told in Europe is that, well, when a household overspends, you need to tighten your belt and spend less. And so we've heard politicians like George Osborne, who was the chancellor here, say there's no plan B but for cuts, or Olli Rehn, who is the head of the European Monetary Commission, saying there is no alternative to cuts. But in fact, there is another view that governments are not like households. And when a government makes a cut in a joined up economy, it affects all of us. That cut is somebody's job. That cut is somebody's income. And it can lead to a vicious negative cycle and slow the economy down. And so politicians in Sweden and the US have pursued this argument for using crisis as an opportunity to invest stimulus. And so despite what we've heard in Europe, what we've seen happen across Europe is another great natural experiment, much like what happened in the Soviet Union at the time of its breakup, where we've had a range of countries pursue different paths in response to the financial crisis. And here I have one example here of US and UK, two countries that had heavily leveraged banking sectors that were at the eye of the storm, betting on derivatives upon derivatives, and it eventually came tumbling, and this is what you can see here in GDP on the left side of the graph. And both bailed out their financial sectors. Both started to chart a slow but steady recovery. And in the UK, the turning point came with the transition to the austerity government of the Conservatives, at which point, with the October 2010 budget, the economy flatlined. And this, we now know, is the slowest recovery from recession that we have in the history of keeping records on recession. So you don't think I'm cherry-picking data. I could do this. Here's Portugal. When it started its austerity, the economy did a U-turn. I could do the same for Spain and many others. I don't want to go too far on the economic side, important as it is. I want to talk about health. And what we've learned from our work is that, is based in this slide. This is a correlation that we give to our graduate students to rip apart in our first year master's sociology courses. And it's the association of social welfare spending, it's cradle to grave support, and life expectancy. And what I'm going to argue in this talk is that this isn't just an association, but that investments in social safety nets, investments in social protection are a powerful investment in our health. And when it's cut and scaled back, it's a huge hazard. So let me take you to cases we've been looking at to test out this social protection hypothesis. And let me take you first to a case you've heard a lot about, and that's Greece. Greece is in the middle of a public health disaster. Let me take you right back to the beginning when it signed its bailout agreement with the International Monetary Fund and the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the so-called Troika in Europe. And like many policies the International Monetary Fund has pursued over the years, it advised Greece, pressure on Greece, as a condition of its loan, to make huge cuts. I mean, to put these cuts in perspective, Greece was being pressured to get its public health spending down to 6% of GDP. I don't know where that figure came from, because the UK spends about 9%, Germany about 11%, US in total is close to 20%. But that's what the macroeconomists came up with as the target for Greece to get on financial footing. And in practice, this was an eye-watering cut. The health minister was asked at the beginning of austerity, you're really going to try to make cuts, for example, in the hospital budget, 40% in 1 year alone? 40% cuts to the hospital? And he threw up his hands and said, look, I don't have a choice here. These aren't cuts that are where I can go look at cost effectiveness and figure out what's going to be the best. I have to make these cuts quickly. These are cuts with a butcher's knife. And if you look at Greece's budget sheet, it does look like somebody just went straight down and hacked away at it. Here we've got maternal and child health, a cut of 73%. Prevention, don't need that so much, that's a 30% cut. And many of these cuts were being targeted at prevention services that have long-term benefit, programs that when they work well, work in silent and are hidden from view. But these are huge cuts taking place. Now, often in epidemiology, there's a lag between, say, smoking and the incidence of cancer. But these cuts had rapid effects, and I've got to give some credit to Alex Kentikalenis, who's been here, a PhD student at Cambridge under Larry, and did a great job digging up and pulling together disparate sources of data on Greece that could tell us what happened. And here's one example. When Greece made deep cuts, cut its HIV prevention budget in half, and virtually wiped out programs that provided clean needles to drug users. This is a strategy to prevent the sharing of infected needles. Greece became the only nation to experience a big outbreak of HIV. And here I have the data on it. It didn't happen when the crisis started in 8 or 9 or 10, but right when Greece's cuts started to hit in 2011. Another example is Greece cut its mosquito spraying programs, which had held malaria at bay since the early 1970s. And after cutting those spraying programs, especially in the agricultural parts of the south, Greece experienced a return of malaria for the first time in 3 decades. And in a paper that, together with Alex, we published in The Lancet and Martin as well, we documented a range of these cause and effect harms from the cuts, from jump in people saying they couldn't get care that they needed. So even in a universal health system, they were being stripped of access, especially pensioners. Saw a 60% jump in suicides, rise in stillbirths, just across the board harm. I don't want to go too far on Greece, because this is a case that still has not resolved itself, even if it's disappeared from view in the media. I want to turn to another case of a financial disaster. And I want to take you to Iceland. So if you were go back to 2008, when this was all starting, if you were in Reykjavik, like I was at the time, your TV would have been interrupted by this man, Gerhard Hart, the Prime Minister. And he interrupted TV with the block white letters on the screen giving a speech saying, "God bless Iceland." He had called an emergency announcement to warn the Icelanders of the greatest catastrophe since World War II. That it was going to be a time of collective hardship and suffering, and the country would need to join together in solidarity to solve it. And he had a point, because all of Iceland's banks had collapsed. Its debt rocketed to 800% of GDP, a figure that's only on par with Zimbabwe. And this was, in a short period of time, the worst banking crisis that we've got on charts. And for a nation that just squandered all its banking assets, it would have few lenders to turn to for support. So, much like Greece, Iceland turned to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. And that bailout came with similar conditions. The IMF was calling for Iceland to make cuts equivalent to half of its GDP in 3 to 5 years' time, including a 30% cut to public health. I remember I was with Martin and Gashstein at the European Health Forum with the next in line for health minister in Iceland. And after a few drinks, took to joking. And he said, well, what's the difference between the IMF and a vampire? One stops sucking your blood when you're already dead. And jokes aside, what I didn't know is when he got back, he had then hashed a plan. When he got back, the health minister of Iceland resigned and said, I refuse to make cuts to public health to pay for the bankers' greed. And these protests were clearly noted because on the street erupted demonstrations with stop signs like these against the IMF, calling it infant mortality funds. Iceland's a tiny nation, but these protests by scale, with about 15% of the population turned outside Parliament. That'd be if in England you had easily 5 to 10 million people protesting austerity in front of the House of Lords. They were clearly noticed because they then triggered a radical option. The president called a referendum. He asked the people what they wanted to do. And so it was, back in 2010, 93% of Icelanders voted no to the plan to go down the path of deep cuts to saddle themselves with the debt of the bankers. And to sum it up, the president said, look, we didn't do what the rest of Europe did. We let the banks fail. And as a result, we put in more support for the poor. We didn't introduce cuts. So we had been working with the National School of Public Health in Iceland with surveys before and after the crisis to see what happened. And what we found, in sharp contrast to Greece, was that we didn't see people losing access to health care. Even though the price of imported medicine rose rapidly, Iceland spent a lot more to make up for that cost. And so people didn't lose, except for dental care, which is privately funded. Commonly, you see people who lose jobs saying they're depressed, anxious about the future. Our surveys found in Iceland that people who lost jobs said they were spending more time with their families and sleeping more. And so even unemployment jumped in Iceland as much as in Greece, thanks to social safety nets and firms to help work return to them, got back on their feet more quickly. And another turn we commonly see when people have a big income shock, they turn to cheaper, energy-dense sources of food that can come with risks of obesity and heart disease. In an odd twist, McDonald's pulled out of Iceland, citing operational difficulties. It turned out that importing tomatoes had become too expensive. I didn't know there were tomatoes in Big Macs, but people instead turned to, there was a big jump in consumption of locally sourced tuna with itself health benefits, and that helped power a domestic boom. And to top it off, in the first World Happiness Reports produced by Richard Layard and Jeff Sachs, which came out in 2011 in the middle of all this, Iceland, which once rated as one of the world's happiest nations, again, in 2011, in the middle of an economic catastrophe, rated as one of the world's happiest nations. Now, I shared some of this data with some colleagues at the IMF, and they're like, this is just a public health dream, that's all well and good, but you guys have no common sense. And then I showed them this graph, and I said, here's the GDP trajectory of Iceland and Greece, and the latest reliable data we still have even now on Greece, and even that's questionable, is from the early 2010s, which just shows a steady sink, where Iceland had a much quicker recovery. And they threw up their hands and they're like, how can you argue with 5% growth and 5% unemployment. The IMF then praising Iceland's recovery. So, what do we make of this comparison? Well, obviously, Greece and Iceland are two extremes that we've taken from the recession to illustrate differences in policies and outcomes. Iceland sits outside the Eurozone, so its currency could devalue. It's also a smaller nation, which makes democratic participation, some argue, more possible. But what this contrast proves, importantly, is that even a big financial shock doesn't need to damage people's health if politicians take steps to protect the weak. Fiscal policy is a matter of life and death. So to test this out further, I won't go too far, but I'll run you through just a couple more examples. To test this out further, we've been looking at historical cases, the post-communist crisis being one of them. And another that's commonly invoked, the Great Depression in the United States. And it had remarkable parallels to the current crisis, had its origins in a troubled housing sector that imploded. It was also a period characterized by a remarkable lack of foresight. The world's leading economist at the time, Irving Fisher, had said in October 1929, stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Well, that was 3 days before Black Thursday, when it all came tumbling, and the rest, you know. And so, in these conditions of terrible hardship, we wanted to know what happened to people's health. And what initially surprised us is when we're combing through the archives in the New York Times, we had read one where the chief medical officer, head of the American Medical Association, equivalent in the US, wrote in and said, never before have there been such good health conditions as in the first part of the 1930s, during the Depression. This was really puzzling to us. We were scratching our heads thinking, how can that be? Can that really be true? So we dug up data from what were then 118 US cities from the basement of the Center for Disease Control archives. And we were able to confirm that, in fact, here's all-cause mortality. Mortality rates dropped during the Great Depression. And this is a pattern, when we dug deeper, we found happening again and again in many recessions. Recessions, counterintuitively, were linked to some health benefits. Yes, we found in the Great Depression suicides jumped, but we also found that when people saved money on fuel and started walking instead of driving, road traffic deaths dropped. And in some cases, we've seen in Europe in this crisis, big drops in road traffic deaths, especially where they were already high, such as in Latvia and Lithuania. But why wasn't it worse? As we had heard about in Eastern Europe and in Greece and in others, and one of the big policy debates that happened then is the same as what we've had today. That debate between whether to make cuts or whether to spend on social protection into the crisis. And this debate happened between the incumbent at the time, Herbert Hoover, and his opponent, Franklin Roosevelt. And at the time, Hoover famously said Americans needed to pick themselves up by their bootstraps to power of recovery. That felt a little out of touch to the Americans lined up outside of soup kitchens who nicknamed the shantytowns Hoovervilles, where his opponent, Roosevelt, campaigned on an alternative that would create over 8 million new jobs for Americans who lost them, that would build new homes to ensure Americans had a roof over their heads and end the Hoovervilles, and invest in schools, hospitals, roads, use the crisis as an opportunity to chart a healthier track. He called his program a New Deal, and he won. But the U.S. is organized in a federal system with a lot of power to the states. So the New Deal couldn't just go through from the top down, it had to go through the localities. And what this did was create another great natural experiment, because some of the left-leaning governors, such as Huey Long in Louisiana, thought Roosevelt wasn't going far enough, where some of the right-leaning governors thought this was the incarnation of crypto-communism and sought to avert it altogether. And so we had a huge variation in the extent to which the New Deal was implemented across the US. And as we looked across the data, we found this led to a polarization across health outcomes, where in states that went harder and deeper on the New Deal, they had bigger reductions in suicides, whooping coughs, which were epidemic at the time, tuberculosis, and infant mortality, and creating an inequality that can still be seen in the data today. The New Deal was, in effect, the biggest public health program implemented on US soil. So it's been important to learn from these historical episodes what we've done wrong, what we can do better, what we can learn from, with resonance for today. And so early in the crisis, we were trying to get our hands on all the data we possibly could that could give us warning signs about what would happen and what we could do to prevent harm. And some of these are with Martin, some are with Larry, and one here that just gives a rundown of what we saw, consistent with the pattern from the Great Depression that we put in the Lancet. This is a forest plot, so I like to look at data. Each of these dots is the association of unemployment with mortality outcome. As we found in recessions that suicides tended to rise and road traffic deaths tended to fall, on average canceling themselves out, so that recessions in and of themselves had a slightly positive effect on mortality rates. And then we probed further to see if there was something we could learn about from a wealth of experience in Europe as a laboratory. Was there something we could do to prevent suicides? And the picture we found here, again highlighting the range of extremes, you can see unemployment and suicide. In Spain on the left, and you see the correlation has been well known since Durkheim in the 19th century. Unemployment rises and falls, suicides tend to rise and fall. If you look on the right, this is a picture that we hadn't seen. This is Sweden when it had a banking crisis in the early 1990s. And if you looked at suicide trends, you wouldn't know anything was going wrong, steadily falling. So Sweden had managed to decouple, much like Iceland and others we looked at in recession, had managed to decouple big economic crashes from the mental health of their people. And this is a pattern we've seen happen again today. Those nations that had stronger protections for workers who lost jobs fared much better. Of course, not everybody agreed with our findings, and a pattern familiar to those of you who've now heard the story about Jeff Sachs. And when we published our first papers with Alex Kentikalanis here on Greece, in the Lancet, we got angry letters in the BMJ from Dr. Lyropoulos. And Lyropoulos was saying, there's no evidence that the crisis has done any harm in Greece. And Lyropoulos said, look, those budget reductions, remember those 40% cuts to the hospital? He said, those are a result of improvements in management efficiency. So by his argument, we should all be a lot more like Greece's healthcare system, and the NHS too could become the most efficient in the world overnight. But no, we were really scratching our heads because this is an esteemed leader in Greece, and his comments came at the very day, at the very week. Mark Spranger, who was then the director of the European Center for Disease Control, went and said, look, I've seen hospitals that had no surgical gloves, no alcohol wipes, were missing gowns because the budget situation was so bad. And he was alarmed that drug-resistant bugs were going to spread on the hospital wards, saying we had 1 minute to midnight in the battle. And then Sam Friedman said, what the Greek government are doing is creating an epicenter for the spread of HIV in Greece and beyond. So we were really puzzled to figure out this denialism until Alex, helpfully speaking Greek, dug into the CV of Lyropoulos and found he was being funded by the Troika to implement austerity in the country. So the message for you is if you're going to do this work, have thick skin and brace for attacks. But not everybody has just denied the evidence. And one of the most surprising admissions of error came from none other than the International Monetary Fund, which if you want some nighttime reading, I recommend the Chief Economist paper here, Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers. But it's a remarkable piece because they conclude we underestimated the negative effect of austerity, unemployment, and spending power. That's a big oops. And it all centers on a little stat called the fiscal multiplier, which, just to tell you about it, I see I'm getting down in time, so I'll speed things up. But it tells you for each pound of government spending how much the economy gets back. So if that multiplier is 0.5, it means it's like you're throwing a bombshell at the economy. You spend a pound and you're only getting about 50 back. Who wants to do that? And that's what they initially assumed was the case. When they reanalyzed the data, I mean, clearly there was a problem. They were saying, Greece, you make cuts 4%, you'll grow 4%. But they were making cuts of 4% and shrinking 4%. There's clearly an error in the model. They looked at the data and found, well, the multiplier was higher than we thought. It was 1.7. And that's when they turned tail. But even this suffered a major flaw. And much of the austerity debate has had big flaws in its thinking because it assumes all government spending works the same. Government spending good, government spending bad. It's really simplistic. But surely, we need more information to make smart decisions about where to cut and where to invest in tough times. And so we took the IMF's methods in a paper with Martin, and we extended it by sector. So we looked at those fiscal multipliers for defense, for health, for education, for the environment. Here's another forest plot, which I like. And you can see the pattern here. The total government multiplier, we estimated, was 1.7, same as the IMF. But on the right, you can see those that were bigger and more positive. Social protection, health, the environment, education. And on the left, your left, you can see those that were in some cases very small or even negative. In the case of defense or economic affairs, that was the term the EU used for bank bailouts. And what was happening as we dug deeper is those funds in defense, they may have been flowing and stimulating economies in Afghanistan and bank bailouts may have been going to offshore tax havens, but they weren't creating jobs or giving a boost to domestic economies because they were flowing out, leading to trade deficits. And so even if you wish to pursue austerity, there's a case to protect health and education. In Europe, we've done the opposite. And you can see that opposite when you look at this graph of the stimulus and austerity countries that shows the rate of recovery from recession on the y-axis and the rate of change in government spending. And what you see at the bottom is Greece, disaster, and at the top right, the stimulus countries, Sweden, Japan, Germany. And Germany preaches the virtues of austerity for others. So just to close, I think there is an alternative in tough times to the path of deep cuts, an alternative that we pursued in the UK before, that worked in the US in the New Deal, and that alternative that I think would work and would be popular, I call a New Deal. And it has essentially three principles. First, to do no harm. If austerity had been run like a drug trial, it would have been stopped. Second, we should help work return to people. And across Europe, we've seen countries that made smart investments in return to work programs, have not only staved off depression and suicides, but also had a faster recovery in their labor markets. And finally, invest in public health. Not a surprise to preaching to the converted here, but the irony is that the epidemics Greece is now in the middle of, malaria, TB, HIV, the European Commission has come out and said they're costing 10 times more to control than they would have been to prevent in the first place. the cliche is really true. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Investing in health is a priority in the good times and an urgent necessity in the bad. Shameless advertising. My team, work with great people. Our book, Body Economic. Thank you.
David, fantastic. We've already got one question from Larry, and then we'll have another. So we'll start with Larry, and then come here, and then go up there.
A few comments, I'll be quick. One,
You need the mic for the recording.
one, I want to congratulate your supervisor. That was a superb job. I'm just kidding. Secondly, Liaropolis.
What? It's just his name.
Dickens? I mean, come on. But three, the real comment is, the evidence you present reinforces the massive economic evidence and historical evidence that austerity is bad economics. Keynes was right. In a recession, you don't want to decrease aggregate demand because capitalists will hold on to their money and they won't reinvest.
Yeah.
Very clear. So when I teach this on political economy, people ask me why do they pursue austerity? It's bad economics. It's bad for health, and the health costs are even worse economics. And so the question, the two questions you always should ask as a political economist is who wins and who loses. So austerity is terrible economics, it's terrible public health, but it's great class politics. And it allows you to roll back the welfare state, which when you can't do it democratically. So yeah.
Yeah, that,
So
exactly
the
right. Didn't
question
have
is
time to
why
get
Liaropolis
into
the
it,
real name?
but yeah. But exactly agreed.
Hi. So you showed a lot of evidence that unemployment is associated with higher mortality, but have you looked at whether it's actually the unemployed who are more likely to have higher mortality? Have you looked at microdata to see whether how the risk of mortality changes with the length of unemployment?
Yeah, so what was interesting in this literature is that you would look at, just taking as an example, the link with mental health, suicide is the most obvious, easiest to study, happens in the short term. About 1 in 3 men who lose a job show symptoms of clinical depression within 6 months. So in places like Finland and Sweden, the microdata were showing, well, there's not really much link of unemployment and harm. And then studies from the US, the UK, and others, Spain, were showing, well, there's a pretty strong link. And this is a classic example of Durkheim's individualistic fallacy, where by zooming in too close and missing the context, you miss a big part of the story. So it really depended on the support in place, whether or not losing a job is harmful. Now, the second iteration of what you bring on this is what happens to the employed. And this is where some of the best research on this has come from Russia, where it's found that people who were scared of losing their job, and particularly scared where there was no safety net, knowing they'd hit rock bottom, experiencing economic anxiety and precariousness about the future, had almost as bad, if not worse, impacts on their health as those who actually did lose their job and get on with it. It's too early to tell from the current crisis in Europe. We haven't seen that data disentangled yet. We're trying to do it now.
Yeah, thanks so much. Fascinating analysis. I have 2 points, if I may. First, about the dynamic implications of Keynesianism. I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to the idea, but the argument goes that, well, there's a credibility problem, time and consistency, that, when the crisis is over, then governments won't, won't cut the expansionary policies again, so you get a debt problem. What would you respond to those? And second, there is also a discussion on the multiplier. Of course, you could cut spending, but you could also increase revenue, right? And economists would say that, well, it's a bad idea to raise new taxation. So you're arguing for spending programs in crisis, but where does the money come from? I mean, obviously you have to finance it. So debt, or what are the options?
So two quick points. One, we'll remember the parable of the ants and needing to save for the cold winter, not consume all the harvest. And many of the countries going into this crisis didn't do that. Greece spent with the aid of money coming in from EU structural funds, private investors. It had a red hot bubble. And that can tell me that was a macroeconomic mistake. Usually the standard advice, as Larry pointed to, was if you've got a temporary deficit, it's a good idea to spend. If you got a structural, a long-term deficit, you need to think about fixing it. And we've done the opposite. These were temporary deficits, most created from bailing out the financial sector. Iceland didn't bail out the financial sector, and that gave it more fiscal flexibility. Politically, that didn't happen in most of the other Western European countries. I remember Martin Wolf put a piece in the Financial Times early in the crisis saying, we're all Keynesians now. Yeah, we were Keynesians with the banks, but we gave austerity to everybody else. Stimulus for the rich, cuts for the poor. And so that's the dynamic I'm more worried about than people continuing to spend on and on and on and on into the future. And as for your second point, I'm just keeping an eye on time. Flag me after and let me get more into detail on that.
So we'll have a last question now.
So thanks very much for your talk. I was really interested in the social welfare hypothesis as to why certain countries seem to have been protected from the bad effects of austerity. So my question is to do with the devolved nations within the UK. Devolution's been around since about the turn of the millennium now. Are we seeing enough of a sort of divergence in policies to be able to make any meaningful comparisons within the UK that might sort of influence this debate?
Funny you mentioned that. That's exactly, you're catching the natural experiment methodology that we employ, where we can't randomize these countries into different policies, but we can make clever imaginative use of those variations that come from different governing structures. So one we've been looking at is the privatization in the NHS that happened in England didn't take place in the same way in Scotland. So we're looking at the performance of the healthcare system just across those borders and finding that already we see England starting to fare worse than Scotland. So there's a lot of rich potential to make better use of devolution, especially with the interesting experiment going on in Manchester, joining up health and social protection budgets. So I hope you'll join us in interrogating those data.
Yeah, talk to me afterwards.
So, thank you, David.
Thank you.